This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with novelist, poet, and essayist Alexander Theroux, author of, most recently, Laura Warholic or The Sexual Intellectual. Alexander Theroux is a novelist, poet, and essayist, perhaps best known for his novels Three Wogs, Darkenville's Cat, and An Adultery. He's been called one of the best proponents of maximalist writing. His newest, biggest book yet is called Laura Warholic or The Sexual Intellectual from Fantagraphics. Alexander, welcome to the program.
Very happy to be here.
Now, about the new book, you can't really understand it unless you get to know the characters, and you get to know them very well throughout the course of the book. The protagonist, Eugene Eyestones, tell us a little bit about him.
You know, I've always been interested in a person that was both idealistic and something of a failure. Vladimir Nabokov once pointed out that, you know, every character is kind of a little ramification of the author. So I've distributed some of my hostilities and fascinations and occasional quirks to him as a character, but I really basically wanted to have him as a kind of raisonneur and a satirical point of departure for the multiple and the multifarious views on life that are presented in the book. So he's sort of the central raisonneur, the thread through the book, which is not to say that he's normal or well-balanced.
You say you give him a few qualities, a few opinions of your own. Which ones are the most prominent in him that you took from yourself?
It's really hard to say because, as Goethe once said, all writing is confession. So, in a way, I've distributed myself throughout the book in various characters. You know, John Keats once pointed out that Shakespeare maybe had a very empty personality. He might have been a very bland person because he gave away his personalities, the various voices that he had, to different people as various as, you know, Prospero, Lady Macbeth, you name it. So I can't really say there's a one-to-one correspondence to much in Eyestones. I mean, his rooms in many ways echo mine. I have a lot of books. I have a portrait of Dostoevsky, blah, blah, blah. But I think I can be found in other characters with equal force as much as in Eyestones. So, you know, there's an occasional shotgun in the corner, metaphorically speaking, my toothbrush over there, a particular vase in the room, in Eyestone's room, but I can't deny that I'm in other places as well. So, as I say, there's no one-to-one correspondence between me and Eyestones or me and any of the other characters in my books. So I would say I distributed myself pretty much throughout and probably have as bland a personality as Keats argued Shakespeare had. Not to make any major analogies here, by the way.
Yeah, of course, of course. Now, you talk about Eyestone's idealism. He has a huge number of ideals, from what I can tell, strongly held in the book. What ideals of his really define him for you?
He has an elevated view of women, although a lot of people would argue vociferously in the opposite direction. But his expectations are high. The genre of this novel is a satire. It's satire. And Eyestones, in a way, through dramatic irony, I try to present him as a corrective to the wayward world, the quark-reversal world, the nutty world, the excessive world, the secular world. So that his point of view, I like to think, is balanced, although, as I say, a lot of people wouldn't agree. So he's kind of anti... There's an attack... Laura Warholic attacks him three-quarters of the way through the book for a lot of lunatic excesses she finds in him. But a lot of those excesses in ideals... Let's take one to make this clear, and I'll try to answer this question. He's kind of disbelieving in the possibility of democracy, or that democracy is a valid form of government. Indeed, he sees it as a leveling force. I spent quite a bit of time on an essay on democracy in this book, which aims in the direction of trying to talk about couples, because there's a certain kind of democracy that's required of people involved in coupledom. There's a kind of match of average you have to kind of settle on, the man and woman, in these days man and man, whatever, but he's kind of doubtful about the possibility of that being successful. So that would be one example. There are many I could go into, but that would be one to make, because I'm going on at length about this already.
Would you call Eyestones the kind of guy who looks around him and is constantly disappointed by the world? Or, I guess in the book you show him having a few moments of not being disappointed, but they are few and far between. Primarily he's disappointed, correct?
Yeah, he's very disappointed. After I wrote Darkenville's Cat, I was going through a period of feeling loveless and was talking to a psychiatrist. I was teaching at Harvard at the time. So I recapitulated a lot of my life. I had been in a monastery for a short time and been in a seminary, but I had gone hither and yon, traveled a bit, and the psychiatrist kind of was looking at me in a kind of querulous way and said to me, which seemed like a periodic remark, "You're always trying to get out of the world," he said. And that led me to a minor disquisition on death, because indeed we're all having to get out of the world eventually. But he found that the case. So I would say yes, to answer your question, that Eyestones is very much disappointed, as satirists are. I mean, Cervantes. Again, I'm not making analogies with myself and Shakespeare or Cervantes, but I'm just saying Cervantes. People like, I think, Cervantes, or maximalists, or pyrotechnic writers, satirists, I would say in general, are very disappointed in the world. I think spanking the world is part of their ambition. Satire is a kind of great tradition of inflicting pain, of being disappointed and inflicting pain. There's a kind of personal partisan, no punch pulling involved in satire. And my book hasn't been well received. It's been basically ignored. I think it's a very important novel, but it's been basically ignored by people. I mean, I've even had a hard time getting editors' attention. It's too long, it's too pyrotechnic, it's too multisyllabic, it's too opinionated, it's endless, there are longeurs, there are digressions. But one of the criticisms is that it's pitiless, even cruel and unsparing. That's what people are not used to. They're kind of used to Tom Wolfe's jokey and affectionate lashings out, kind of like cartoon explosions. But, you have to kind of look at like Hunter Thompson's attacks to see real cruelty. People, I just don't think they understand I don't know anybody that's doing this book is not being written by anybody. This kind of prose, this kind of writing. And as I say, I think because it's too savage, it's too unflinching. And people just don't want this. Why do you have such attitudes, people tell me? You're so extreme, you're so opinionated. This is so savage. But satire, my point is savage. And, I'm thinking of a remark that Nathaniel West once made in The Day of the Locust, when he said, "Nothing is sadder than the truly monstrous." And I find the world monstrous. Just in the news that Israel won't let 8 Fulbrights, Palestinian Fulbrights, and the way the United States has cravenly rolled over and let Israel dictate whether these 8 scholars, high-minded people, can't even get out of that horrible place in Gaza to come to the United States to be Fulbrights. That's the kind of thing I'm attacking. That's the kind of pain I'm inflicting. That's the kind of no punch-pulling, unsparing, pitiless, even cruel attitude that I try to launch in the book, because we're living in a really savage time.
And you mentioned how editors would criticize the book about the degree of savagery in it. And it made me think of the content of the book, of the large cast of characters, and how many of the secondary characters, perhaps all of them, launch into very long tirades against whatever their personal hobby horse is.
There's a lot of ethnic attacks. There's a lot of... I decided to pull no punches. I mean, I'm not going to go on record in personalizing any of these things, but I had great delight in holding the mirror up to a lot of attitudes that are held today by many people. So there is a kind of a savage cast of characters, in short. I couldn't get the attention of a lot of editors for this book. I can't even find an agent. I notice some of my books on the internet, people say remarks that I'm grumpy or, unapproachable. Or whatever. I mean, it's amazing to me that this kind of seed has got into the ground, because I'm not grumpy at all. I've pulled certain triggers in this novel and other of my novels, but I could go into Yeats's theory of the anti-self, which your writing is the opposite of what you are. I don't know if you know that theory, but it's always intrigued me. I'll just drop this subject in a minute. But his point was that John Keats was a very unhappy, suffered great unhappiness from Fanny Braun, whom he loved and didn't love him back, but that his poetry is very happy, and that Dante, according to Yeats's theory of the anti-self, that Dante was a very sensual person. And why? Because Yeats points out that his writing is spiritual. That the artist is always directing his attention toward the mask rather than the face. I hope I'm being clear here.
It's interesting that the criticism would be toward you, but attributing the opinions of your characters, and the opinions of your characters conflict, and they would attribute those to you and call you the savage one?
It's called negative capability, or it's attributing, the idea of attributing to the author the attitudes of his characters. I mean, that's one of the reasons I had difficulty. As I say, certain editors just sent it back. I mean, I'm convinced that most editors, of course, couldn't tell a good manuscript from a box of shingles. I mean, I seriously mean that. I mean, so many good books have been refused and good manuscripts, but I've always been accused of being kind of a loony and a savage. But I had real high hopes for the book because, in a way, it's a potpourri of a lot of my thought. And I remember reading once where Steinbeck had great ambitions for East of Eden because he thought he could never do again, at the time that was published, the compilation of opinions that he kind of distributed to his characters in that book. And I had the kind of feeling in this kind of learned, it's in the genre of the encyclopedic or learned novel. And let me say, but it's seen as too long, too learned, too pyrotechnic, too encyclopedic. But I just want to turn the corner here for a minute, because in the light of all that, I really wanted to write something that was funny. I mean, because my belief is that this novel is comic, and does have a lot of comic intentions. But senses of humor don't translate very easily or well.
You mentioned that the novel has not been recognized as comic as it is. Why do you think that is?
I don't think I'm seen as someone that's worthy of major attention. When I was at graduate school at the University of Virginia, Annie Dillard was a friend of mine. She went to Hollins College, and I would see her periodically. But, her novel, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, was reviewed by Eudora Welty. I'm just getting into a kind of grumpy point here, but it clarifies my answer to your question. So Annie Dillard's book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, was reviewed by a very large-hearted, noble person named Eudora Welty, whom you know. Mm-hmm. So Eudora Welty gave it a very large-hearted and hyperbolic review, and she won the Pulitzer Prize, Annie Dillard did. But my book, it was given to a complete Yahoo for the New York Times Book Review, the kind of sine qua non of reviews in the United States. And so if you don't get a good review in the Sunday New York Times, your book basically goes into the drink. Now, Anthony Burgess picked my novel, Darkenville's Cat, as one of the best 100 books written since World War I. But it was badly reviewed by a grudging half-wit who taught at Amherst, a professor. The book died in its cradle in 1982, and only later, when a large-hearted and I think rather insightful critic named Anthony Burgess reviewed it. So a lot of writers will say, oh, this is just kind of sour grapes and complaints and the standard thing. But my novel, Laura Warholic, was reviewed by a dunce, a complete dunce, and a rivalrous novelist, I gather. But it gave no attention to the book, to the 900 or so pages of the book. Whereas someone in a Princeton review, gave it a full attention, not necessarily praise, but gave it a full, large-hearted, open-hearted, humble attention. Because, you can't write a book over the course of 4 years and have it read in a grumpy Saturday afternoon by some mal-educated nitwit and have the book be understood. So when the book was given a kind of short shrift in the book review, I knew a decade or more would go by. But I promise you, this is the most important novel published this year. One of the things I loathe about Rush Limbaugh is his self-promotion and self-aggrandizement. But I'm trying to honestly tell you that if people get in to see the fine grain of this book and will patiently read it from A to Z, I think they will come to agree with me. I'm not saying they'll like me or like everything they read in it. So there's a kind of long-winded, self-promoting digression there, but...
These critics, the ones that didn't quite handle the book as well as you
or
would
that
like.
ignored it.
Yes. The ones that didn't ignore it, the ones that did review it, of those, of the things that they misunderstood about the book, what do you think was the most misunderstood element? What did they most not get about Laura Warholic?
Before I attempt to answer that question, I have to tell you, first of all, that no first-rate critic has read it. John Updike just sat on his hand, who promised that he'd review the book. He lives in my state, and he promised he'd review the book. He just basically sat on his hands because there are some very disturbing themes in this novel. And I just think there's a kind of... we live in a very scrimped time when people are ill-disposed to want to really push the boat out for a book. I was hoping people like Joyce Carol Oates or Annie Proulx, whom I know and is a friend of mine, and John Updike, whom I know, that might have actually given it a bit of help, just some kind of attention. So I want to answer your question by first saying that nobody, and I don't want to use the word important here in a class or an elitist sense, but nobody of significance has reviewed the book. I mean, there has been no significant critic that has reviewed the book. The nitwits that have reviewed it have picked up some pathetic things. Let me just make one point. When I was teaching at Yale, the woman that was raped in Central Park by 5 or 6 savages really bothered me. And so I wrote an article where I said that they were monkeys and didn't deserve the space that they inhabited. But, I didn't use the word monkeys as a code word for black or African-American people, but it was seen that way. That was a horrible event and a misguided remark of mine. I really have no problem at all but in that department. But the reviewer in the book review brought this whole thing up that had nothing to do with anything in the novel at all. So he put a racial tinge on the novel that it didn't have. It's so easy to read a satire and be offended. You know that Daniel Defoe once wrote an essay called on the unreasonableness of Christianity, in order to point out that it was reasonable, but he used a satirical kind of mode. And Daniel Defoe was put into the stocks in London and humiliated as being completely misunderstood, because I do have some black characters in the novel. But this person, the mal-educated Herbert that reviewed the book, managed to find these little quirks and little spins that he put on it to be offended, organized himself to be offended.
You think he was looking for a reason to be offended?
I just think he was a grudging small potato that didn't want to read this book in the way it was written, with a rather large Tintoretto-esque canvas, and be willing to read it and find this or that worthy of attention. I'm not looking for praise, by the way, in any of this. I'm looking for attention and intelligence, an intelligent response. It doesn't have to be favorable. I think the format of satire it's a very dicey genre.
Do you think the prime stumbling block for critics was the length of the book, or, as you said, the themes of the book?
I'm going to answer that question by saying this. It often happens. Human nature can be very dark. You can come to someone's house for dinner. Say a couple invites people to dinner and puts a large centerpiece on the table, and really the best silver and the best wines. It's very common for people to leave that kind of dinner, and rather than be delighted and full of praise of the person, that the effort that the person went into it, says, who does he think he is? Who do they think they are? All that gussied up, that table. Did you notice that centerpiece? I just think the book is long, large, opinionated, quarrelsome, angular. Dwarves and pusillanimous people can't take it. I'm going to make another really kind of pathetic analogy, but it's always depressed me in reading the Gospels how Jesus in Nazareth was so poorly treated. Now, this is no analogy that I'm making between me and Christ. I'm just trying to point out that it's so typical for Christ to come and preach. The first time he went into the temple, into the synagogue, he was asked to read a scroll of Isaiah, and he read it. He read it, and he was criticized, first of all, for pontificating about it. He was criticized because his father was a carpenter. He was criticized because he was from Nazareth. He was criticized for being an upstart. And then 3 years later was crucified. I mean, this is a man, we don't appreciate bounty, I guess is my conclusion. I realize, by the way, in this conversation, I've compared myself to Shakespeare, Christ, Cervantes, but...
For the benefit of the audience who have not read Laura Warholic yet, I suppose we should get a little more into the characters and what happens between them now. We've got Eye Stones, we discussed Eye Stones. The title character in this book, Laura Warholic herself, quite possibly the least appealing woman I have ever read in any book. What is she? Who is she?
Okay, first of all, I was interested in a couple, and presenting the kind of foreground couple is not just another Romeo and Juliet or Seinfeld in his whatever that woman is. I mean, I was interested in having a kind of really mismatched, odd couple. And Eye Stones is as bewildered that he's with Laura as Laura is bewildered that she's with him. And when I say with him, they don't fit in any definable way. He exploits her to some degree and regrets it all along. He's using a lot of her quirks and attitudes in the column that he writes. And she sees him as a kind of safeguard or sanctuary for the kind of rather unhappy and ass-backwards life that she's living. It happens so often in life that these people are together in a kind of odd, non-Kodak-like moment world where they kind of lean against each other like straw people, are occasionally happy with each other, are competitive with each other. And that mismatch, to me, allowed for a lot of the sparks in the writing, because I didn't want to have another standard Hollywood or television couple that's kind of, played by Meg Ryan and who's that hydrocephalic actor? Tom Hanks.
Yes.
It's a very odd couple, in short.
What kind of relationship would you say that Eye Stones and Laura even have? Because it's not what you would call a romantic relationship in any sense, to my mind.
And it's not even a relationship with a capital R. I mean, it's really a kind of union. But then you could say, is it a union? And I addressed that in that essay on democracy. Are they a couple? Is a couple a pair? Are they a pair? Are they matched? These nouns don't work for pair, P-A-I-R, couple. I hope you can understand my working-class Boston accent, by the way.
Yes, yes.
But pair, couple, union, relationship, they're all kind of insufficient to talk about the way these people fall into step, and which they don't really even do. Do you remember Horton the elephant is sitting on the egg?
Yes, yes.
But, I mean, it has to do with that.
Now, Laura, she's, as I mentioned, so very unappealing, so unattractive, rail-thin, possibly the flakiest person I've ever heard of in life or in fiction, commits to nothing, really is nothing, leads a very desultory lifestyle. What does Eye Stones want? What could he possibly want from someone like this?
He has a kind of, in a negative way, has a kind of messianic compulsion to want to take care of her. It's pity, which is a vice, according to Graham Greene in the novel Brighton Rock. I don't know if you know that novel, but he sees the vice of pity. He has a kind of horrible messianism in the way that I'm thinking of the character, protagonist in Ford Madox Ford, the good soldier, Ashburnham has, this kind of misguided messianism. But at the same time, he cares for her and tries to help her out of some of the messes and situations that she's in. The novel takes place really in the course of between a September and a New Year's Eve, but it flashes back a couple of years. So it's not like a lifetime relationship, and it's kind of tangential. But there's an argument that there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of this kind of couple in the world.
There's a lot more than anybody reading the book would think.
Well, when you see people going out the checkout counter of a Stop and Shop or an A&P or a Piggly Wiggly store, there's Mike and there's Harriet, and you think, well, Harriet, go get the beans, and would you hold this cart for a minute? I mean, it's so easy to think that these couples are three-dimensional and organized, and he's next to her. But I have trouble with that in fiction, and I think if you really look closely at that couple, and it is a novel of cognition, and writers are, the great novels are all cognitive in a way. I mean, you're always wondering why Ishmael is friendly with Queequeg, and what is the commitment of these people to Ahab? And, you know, just as at the beginning of that novel, when Ishmael is looking at that, when I was teaching that novel, I used to always explain that when he's listening to Father Mapple's sermon, or he's looking at certain paintings of the whale at the beginning of that novel, it's a kind of point of departure for the cognitive requirement that the reader has in reading that novel to try to figure out what's the meaning of this. You know, I mentioned in the novel that that's the purpose of living. You know, what is the meaning of life? You know, we're going to each hang up this phone and go about our day. But the non-seeker, the person that's not looking for meaning, and I'm asking a person to do that in life as I'm asking myself to do, in the same way that I'm asking the person to read the novel, as they say, the person that wrote the reviews, you have an obligation as a reviewer and as a liver of life to seek meaning, to find the meaning things, to turn over stones. I was in church yesterday, people walking out at the post-communion, talking at the back of the service, a perfunctory 5-minute sermon. I just don't think people, I'm sounding really epistemological now, but people don't want meaning. They don't want to find the significance of things.
Is that observation that people don't want to find meaning, was it part of the foundation of this book when you began to write it? That was a theme going in you knew you wanted to hit?
Yeah, I've always, you know, I worked very hard, and each page is a mountain. I worked very hard to make almost every page worthy to be read. I have great respect for readers, but they never very rarely live up to my dream counterpart. Because I think people just basically want to go to the beach with a beach read. You look at the bestseller list, you look at trashy novelists like John Grisham. People they want a good detective novel. And so many writers are rewarded for just absolute trash. I mean, I don't even think the genre itself is really at a very high water mark at this point.
You mean literature entirely?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, using my novel as a benchmark, I think people just don't want anything complicated. I'm remembering, Flem Snopes, in the Snopes trilogy, there's one point where someone's trying to sell him a horse, and he doesn't buy the horse, the wily Flem Snopes. And someone asked him when he's walking away, asked him why he didn't buy the horse, and Flem Snopes said, I didn't believe what the person was saying. It wasn't complicated enough. I think my books are too complicated. And I think this particular novel that we're talking about is too complicated.
Is this the most complicated novel you've ever done?
Yeah, I think it's my longest and most ambitious effort.
And has it been less well received than all of your others, you think, as a result? Or?
It hasn't been received at all. I think it sold 6,000 books. It wasn't reviewed. I haven't seen one intelligent review, or one worthy review, or one review that really addresses it. People listening to this are going to just think I'm so crabby and so in such a self-inflated way saying, oh, woe is me. But we're talking about serious books. When I review a book, I consider it almost a mission, not a trade, to review it with, all my strongest intelligence and my largest heart. I reviewed Against the Day, Thomas Pynchon's book, and I spent, a long time trying to come to terms with that book as a reviewer.
And what publication was that for?
It was for the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, okay.
I think it was the first review of that book, by the way.
That's one I'm going to want to look up, one I somehow missed in my research.
Yeah.
What did you think of the book?
I thought parts of it were very inaccessible. As a lot of parts, I was just in Estonia the last 3 or 4 months and reread Gravity's Rainbow. And I guess one of my complaints, I didn't fully announce it in the review of Against the Day, but did mention it in passing, that a lot of Thomas Pynchon is very inaccessible. Math and scientific areas that I guess you could really apply, but he's relentless. I mean, I tried to make this book very readable with short chapters. Dostoevsky once advised someone to write short chapters, and I always was very appreciative in his novels, I say the Brothers Karamazov, that the chapters were short. Because a book is an artifact. I mean, you have to be able to pick it up and put it down. Thomas Pynchon doesn't allow you to get certain footholds in his books. And I think it's a great fault, and I think it's a kind of vanity on his part, and it may be even a kind of closet refusal, or he's kind of hiding an experiment in some ways, because why obfuscate? I claim that every single sentence in Laura Warholic is understandable, but there are places that are so obfuscated in Against the Day and Gravity's Rainbow, so outre, that you can't really put your arms around it in those places. And that's his failure as a writer. You know, I once in a review criticized John Ashbery for writing obfuscatory lines and poems that made no sense whatsoever. And he took great umbrage and wrote me a nasty letter. But, you know, I think it's a great fault in a writer. Great writers can be understood. Henry James' The Sacred Fount is a novel I find complicated unnecessarily, and certain Gertrude Stein. And there are certain writers that just are offensive because they can't be read clearly. And I think that's a great fault in a novelist. And I'm proud of the fact that my books can all be read. You might have to look up a word or go back a few pages to check something out, but that was one of the difficulties I always had in Pynchon's novels, that he's intentionally obfuscating.
In discussions about a certain style of writing, I'll often hear Thomas Pynchon and you clumped into the same group of what they call maximalist writers.
I've never seen my name linked with him at all.
Oh, really? I've seen it a couple times in the last few days, but it's not like I'm constantly seeing it, but I hear it put under the umbrella of maximalism. And is that a term that you've heard attached to yourself a whole lot?
Yeah, I've heard that attached to me. You know, Thomas Pynchon's wife was once my agent and never really helped me much. I don't know if she saw me as a rival, but I love Pynchon. I think he has a great sense of humor. He's so brilliant, and that's the tragedy with a small t in his books, because where he could make, you know, even with full application. And I have a doctorate in literature, and I'm often in many places left completely outside that cathedral when I'd like to be a worshiper inside. But I understand maybe 82% of his books. But there's that other percentage. It's sad that there's no foothold for me there. Maybe there are other people that don't have that complaint, but that's my complaint. But I do have a kind of a pyrotechnic or maximalist prose style.
If you only understand 82% of Pynchon's books, how much do you think the average Pynchon reader, and there are quite a few of them, gets from his books?
There's a real cult for him, and you know, you can go there with goodwill, to his books with goodwill. You know, we have a short life, so you can't spend your life. I mean, I think I understand a great percentage, maybe 97% of Ulysses, because it's a very lucid novel, a very funny novel, very rewarding. But you know, I think the average person bails on Pynchon almost all the time. I know there's a big website and there's a great cult for him, but I think he has a lot of bailers out there.
Now, I wanted to get back to the subject of Eugene and Laura in, of course, the book. And Eugene is the sexual intellectual of the title. He has the column for the magazine Quink, the sex column called The Sexual Intellectual. Mm-hmm. And does Laura serve him as a kind of specimen for that?
He sees her really as in a kind of unfair way at times, but as a kind of litmus test for things that he's thinking. Now, let me just say this. He had a lot of ideas of the book, because I think to the sexual, and I'm not just talking about, you know, pornography at all. I'm talking about just the ways people's sex lives are, their preoccupations, what they like, the way their lives are led. It's a very interesting subject and a key to the door of the complexity of man. I always had an amazing interest, not a priapic interest at all, but just in some of the excesses and lunacies and remarkable sort of instances that are worthy of writing down about the sexual behavior and attitudes of people. And sprinkled onto the book, I mean, that was one of my ambitions in writing the book, that it's an interesting subject to me. You know, it's one of the kind of side rooms of love and jealousy, and, you know, you find this in all great novels. I mean, in Proust, in Dickens' books to a degree. I mean, I was fascinated with just that subject, or that thematic thread in the book. So to answer your question, I hope not in a forced way, but there is a kind of tour de force involved in having Eyestone's pivot from observations he makes of Laura, but indeed of many of the other characters in the book, along with his own kind of a priori opinions before he takes this job, to make that a kind of leitmotif of the novel.
There is one chapter called What in Love or Sex is an Odd, which lists a whole bunch, and I mean a whole bunch of facts relating to sex throughout the history of man that are, in fact, odd. And throughout the entire book, there are many odd facts that are dropped, sometimes in list form. Were these facts that you knew the topic of the book and then you researched, or were they things that you happened to know that aligned with your interests?
I'm a very wide reader, so there are things that I remembered, things that I observed, things that I read, things that I had heard. But let me ask you a question. Did you enjoy that chapter?
In fact, I did enjoy that chapter, one of my favorites.
Because you can't not enjoy that chapter. One critic pointed out it was like eating potato chips, that you have to keep going, because it's just nothing more than enunciations of real facts about some of the sexual proclivities and oddities and excesses of people. It can't not be read with anything but kind of delight, no matter what your attitude may be about me and my writing. And I knew that chapter would be interesting to anybody, because if that's not interesting to people, I mean, you're dead. It seems to me you're dead if you don't find that interesting. There's almost nothing salacious in it, and there's very little that's salacious in this novel, because I take no pride in that kind of, nudge stuff. I was a lifeguard in the early 60s and was reading Lolita, and a cop came up who had heard of this novel, because there are no four-letter words in the novel. And there's very little salacious that's in the book. There are kind of, a patina of salacity in the book. But so the cop took the book aside and, basically and predictably came back in about 20 minutes and said, "It sucks." He threw the book down because he was looking for the kind of, blue pages that are just not there. So I'm sure you agree that there's nothing salacious in that chapter and very little or nothing salacious in the book.
I wanted to ask about the reactions, or how the reactions differ between the chapter we just mentioned, What in Love or Sex is an Odd, and a chapter that comes earlier in the book, which is exactly an essay from Eugene Eyestone's that was submitted to Quink and that his editor, Warholic, not Laura but her ex-husband, rejected. They cover similar ground, sex-related insights into men.
You're talking about a chapter called A Controversial Essay.
Yes.
Now, this is kind of one of the bookends of the novel, because I find that subject fascinating. I'm just going to recapitulate the chapter quickly in a couple of sentences, because it's a kind of one of my beliefs, and I want to put beliefs in quotation marks, that a lot of women have a difficulty in the creative department. Not that they're not better skilled at it at times in many instances than men, but a woman has to rise above her biology in a way, to sculpt, to write, because a woman in housing a child, and there are some real subtleties in this argument that have to be paid attention to, because a woman can have a baby and house a baby, and her DNA is arranged to support that baby. She has a great creativity that defines her, that men don't have. Men are basically sterile. And it's my theory. Again, I could argue the opposite if I felt like it. I'm going to launch this pro, and I could launch the con if you want, but in the pro department, I'm just saying that I believe that men, to a degree, are sterile. We don't feel the asperity of having a child as fathers. So we write novels, we sculpt as attempts to be creative, whereas a woman has to rise above her biology to do that, and she does it often better than men. I mean, I'll never be as great a novelist as George Eliot, say, Mary Ann Evans, but I believe that you have to get into a woman has to get into a certain frame of mind to create. And in that essay, I try to support that argument. Now, it's a very controversial, seemingly fascist-like argument. There's no misogyny involved in this at all. But I was once gave a lecture at Radcliffe when I was teaching at Harvard in the 70s. I was kind of toying with this subject in a very amicable way. And of course, this was a an age, and at 74, 75, when, the feminist movement was in a high gear. But I didn't even get 5 sentences out of my mouth when a student stood up and said, I'd like to stick a bread knife into you, unquote. So it's a very long and very complicated chapter. And a person has to read this from A to Z to really see what I'm getting at. But I tried to give in a kind of capsulized way what some of the book is about, because it touches upon some of the things that, as you point out accurately, are later touched upon in various places in the novel. And it's called a controversial essay because most people are prone to misunderstand it. But in fact, it glorifies women, the nature of women, although a lot of people won't agree with that. See, this is one of the things about this novel, that if you only look at it, if you look at it with a half a brain or in a couple of hours, you're not going to be doing justice to the pages.
I want to ask a little bit more about Laura herself. I've mentioned it twice, I think, how unappealing she is.
Yes.
Why did you want to make her so repulsive?
I wanted to make her not fully repulsive as much as an angled character. I mean, I wanted to give her a small dimension. It's not like she's a kind of bookend to the character Rapunzel in the novel, who's, hyperbolically presented as almost perfect. You remember her?
Oh, yes, of course. I couldn't forget.
She's kind of the alternate Laura, but in that magnetic field between the two people, I've tried to make hay. And I want to say that, there are places where Laura Warholic is actually, I thought, commendably ironic, I think praiseworthily energetic, if not pretty. People say that the sign of a great character, a female character, is energy. That Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair, that even Tom Sawyer's girlfriend, is it Becky Thatcher, Natalia Rostova in War and Peace, that the sign of a great character is not necessarily good looks, but energy. That's one thing that Laura has in the book. I mean, she's indolent as far as having a job is, but I think she's well seen and certainly can be, if not praised, at least appreciated in the dimension of energy.
She does have energy, but what is that energy directed toward?
It's directed towards surviving, because that seems to be her main ambition.
Just a biological persistence.
Yes, although it doesn't lead to a happy ending, we both know.
The cast of characters behind Eugene and Laura, the large number of them, there's, of course, the members of the Office of Quink, and there's many more besides. Most of them you describe with a certain amount, and by a certain amount, I guess I mean a lot of grotesquerie. Many of them are grotesque, and they're bulging, and they have odd hair and strange styles of dress. It made a picture in my mind that was, I don't know if you'd even call it ugly at a certain point, kind of like a kaleidoscope of weirdness, maybe. Was that a conscious choice to make everybody so eccentric?
Yeah, it's kind of a satirical vehicle. One may think of people like Flannery O'Connor doing. She once said that the world is blind, so you have to draw large figures. The world is deaf, so you have to shout loud. You know that. I don't know if that famous essay of hers. I think it's in a book called The Habit of Being. But I tried to have people. I have a character that's anti-Semitic. I have a person that attacks God. I have a gay person. I have a person that stutters. I have a person that's a miser. In other words, there was a Latin writer named Theophrastus, and then there was a French writer named La Bruyère. And I'm well aware that types that intrigue me, they're picked up and defined, even if you may think in a lame way, to make some satirical points about people. So it is a kind of rogues gallery, a kind of very kind of crippled aggregate of characters. Some are winning, but some are not. Again, there's always a comic thrust behind it.
One of the other things the critics have said about the book is that there's no plot. I kind of disagree with that, and I would imagine you disagree, but how do you respond to that charge?
I've been accused of that before, for instance, in Darkenville's Cat, where there's a very serious plot. And this particular novel is a very serious plot. But the reason, the thing is, over the course of
800 or 900 pages. I read one critic that said, I just wrote a bunch of essays and basically have no talent as a fiction writer, but this is just a potpourri or a compilation of essays. It's a ludicrous point because there's an actual story from the beginning to the end of this book. But your question's well taken, and I will drop the story in order to make a chapter that I felt I need to put in there. You could look at Moby Dick, for example, and say, the Longueurs and the whale just destroyed the novel. But I never felt that for a minute because of the importance of what the whale is. His size and dimensions have to be pointed out. And the cetological chapters in Moby Dick are totally important in that novel because Melville is supporting the story with those seeming digressions. So I'm actually trying to support my novel, the props of this novel, with occasional essays. I wrote a novel called An Adultery once. It was a chapter on adultery. There were digressions on painting in that novel. But only a fool will read the book and see that because the story is not directly moving or kinetic from A to Z without any stops over. And the encyclopedic novelist is always stopping. Henry Fielding did it constantly, and Tom Jones. Melville did it in Moby Dick. Joyce does it in the Aeolus chapter, say in Ulysses, where he has that newsroom, but the story is always brought forward. I defend this novel that the story is always being brought forward from the beginning to the end. It's just dunces don't want to stop and listen to those and watch those digressions. And that's why dunces always complain about the cetological chapters in Moby Dick. They're just boring, they say. Well, I want to find out if Ahab's going to die, they say. Whatever happened to Fedallah? Get to the goddamn point, Melville.
Is this a problem that is just the very nature of the encyclopedic novel, that it faces these stumbling blocks to a wide audience because it has these digressions?
Yeah, because people are just not learning. That's why bad music is played on the radio, and that's why I mentioned Rush Limbaugh before. That's why he's popular, because he's a moron. The other day I listened to him periodically. He was trying to boast that he knows classical music. He never went to college. Now, I'm not making an elitist point here, but he's a stupid man, and his popularity, widely listened to people are often stupid. I mean, he's an absolute dunce. He makes about 5 grammatical mistakes every half hour. He's a limited intelligence, and that's why he's popular. Because people, they don't want to think. They don't want to have their feet put to the fire. They don't want to look up a word. They don't want to listen to that illusion. That's why I'm basically very sympathetic to Thomas Pynchon, because I deeply appreciate the work he's done in his books. So Rush Limbaugh is almost the archetype of the fool. He thinks he's popular because he's intelligent and reasonable. He's popular because he's a dunce.
He thinks he's popular for the same reasons that Thomas Pynchon has his cult following?
I can't explain the cult following, except that I can't believe that that so many people are that intelligent that can read him on a high level. So I'm bewildered a bit by the so-called cult. I really don't know the nature of the cult. I know that he has a big website, and I know that his name is always mentioned, but I don't know. Sometimes people take hand in a relay race. They'll take, what is the thing that's passed off?
The baton, I think.
They'll take the baton and just kind of almost programmatically mention Pynchon in relation to the learned writer or the encyclopedic novelist. But I'm dubious about how wide his readership is.
I've been thinking a lot in recent days about any creative effort, especially writing, being, the usual saying is, a war against cliché. And how much of a war against cliché are you engaging in when you write?
In a total war against cliché. And that's a great remark, because I used to teach a fiction course in various universities, and always say, great writing is an assault against cliché, because that's the lameness of people, of so many bad writers. I don't want to make enemies in listing bad writers, but so many bad writers, that are popular, they just don't work at avoiding the clichés. It's so easy to just fall into those clichés. It's so painful to read them. I can just bear. I once had to review an Anne Rice novel called Taltos for the Chicago Tribune. I was just throwing the book across the room. I mean, just stick figures. She's awful, and yet she's hugely popular.
Why do readers let that off the hook? Why do they let the cliches off the hook, do you think?
People just are not that intelligent. I mean, it's going to be one of my complaints when I go before the great throne, that why didn't God make more intelligent people? Now, I'm not saying intelligence I'm asking that a human being be more than intelligent. A person has to be loving and charitable and kind and godly and decent. But a person should be intelligent. It's like we're going back to the point I was making about the purpose of living is to find the meaning of it. You have to find the meaning of living. And you have to drag your body through life and your mind through life and your spirit through life. But you have to try to fill your mind and fill your soul and fill your spirit. But people are lame. They don't want to be taxed. You know, when people call up Rush Limbaugh and say it's an honor to speak to you, I want to shoot myself. It's such an offense, that kind of offense against the first commandment. So I don't think people really want to examine their hearts or their minds or their spirits. That's my answer. They don't want to read complicated books. They don't want to listen to Mozart. They don't want to study hard. They don't want to be patient in listening to why someone's suffering. They don't want to let Fulbright scholars come to the United States.
Is Laura Warholic one of your biggest blows yet against that?
It is. It's a total attack upon mediocrity, that novel.
The book, once again, is Laura Warholic, or The Sexual Intellectual Alexander Theroux. Thank you so much for coming on the program. It's
a real pleasure to be on the program, and I want to thank you for your questions, which are very well thought out, and I'm very, very grateful for your attention.
Well, I'm glad to ask you them, glad to have you here. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.